so much of, especially intelligence work and more policing has turned towards kind of preemptive types of interventions, but especially with kind of like high policing, right? The idea of security and high security. This is more and more, growing from this kind of counterinsurgency model that, goes back 40, 50 years about getting intelligence, isolating, key components and, incapacitating key components and really having a very strong form of intervention.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada. Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, over the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of mobilization of Indigenous movements and allies against the expansion of oil and gas pipelines out west, the massive Idle No More movement, as well as the movement to bring attention to the murdered and missing Indigenous women all across the country. Now, what we haven't really been talking about is how Canada's intelligence agencies have been working hand in hand with the largest mining and extraction corporations in Canada to surveil and suppress these movements. Today, I have an interview with Jeff Monaghan, who's an associate professor at Carleton University in the Institute for Criminology and Criminal Justice. Dr. Monaghan and Andrew Crosby in 2018 wrote a book called Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent and the Security State. Here's my interview with him. How would you characterize how the average Canadian looks at Canada's intelligence agencies, CSEC and RCMP and whatnot? So just a general overview.
Yeah, that's a good question. For the most part, these agencies, at least the kind of security, intelligence, national policing arm of the RCMP, CSIS, CSEC, these other national security agencies, for the most part, they're very opaque agencies, right? Like, I think if people know about them, they kind of know about them in the background. People can say what CSIS is, but I don't think that we have a really strong kind of popular or democratic control or discussions about the practices of what these institutions do. Obviously, the RCMP is a bit separate in terms of everyday policing. We do have, conversations about everyday policing, but the National Security Wing of the RCMP, not so much so. And when we do hear about these institutions, it's often because, there's some kind of documents that have been found or some kind of practices that are being contested in court that kind of, or, lawsuits within these institutions of disgruntled employees who have been harassed or marginalized in different ways. So every once in a while we get splinters of information from and about the practices of these institutions, but a lot of the time I think they're really backgrounded. For the most part in Canada, these institutions kind of have a trust us, it's okay kind of attitude. They rely on the threat of terrorism and really marshaling the threat of terrorism that's out there, and really kind of, certainly in the last 2 decades in the war on terror, really kind of hyping the idea that there's really prominent everyday terrorism threats out there, and they should just be trusted with what they do.
And so in your book, you really go into detail about the kind of the nexus between the intelligence agencies in Canada with mining and the mining and extraction sectors.
So in our book, Policing Indigenous Movements, that I co-wrote with my colleague and friend Andrew Crosby, there it is. So this is kind of a catalog for probably around a 10 or so year period from kind of the mid-late 2000s to the late 20-teens. And so this is really looking at how security agencies in Canada survey and police a pretty broad array of Indigenous and allied movements. And almost all of these issues, as we know, are always related to land conflicts and related to certainly in the kind of the 2000s and early 2010s, related to the former conservative government's efforts to be an energy superpower, to build a bunch of pipelines, all kinds of effort to deregulate environmental controls and stuff like that. So all of these different movements intersect with issues of extraction and resource extraction. And in this mix, so in this period of time, the kind of the core argument that we put forward in the book is that the resources of the war on terror, surveillance, policing, and also ideology, kind of ideological resources about threats, about terrorism, about notions of extremism, these are all marshaled in the context of the war on terror, that are, you know, these resources are prioritized by saying, you know, Al-Qaeda this, ISIL that in later years, you know, we need national security and national security infrastructure. And then when, you know, the operations of these bureaucracies kind of get going, a lot of the resources are directed quite domestically towards good old-fashioned policing problems and colonial kind of priorities, and target environmental and indigenous groups. And so in this mix, there ends up being a kind of overlap of interests between the extraction companies, who were totally on board, obviously, with the pipeline agenda and the energy superpower agenda. There's, you know, the political kind of orbit, or the political field of politicians who are absolutely in line with the companies, and then the police kind of overlap with these two other groups to really kind of join up and have an aligned set of interests. So what happens in this kind of course of events is that there was a kind of an institutional merger of police and the private companies within the national security apparatus to try and, you know, a lot of times these are justified by these folks by saying, listen, we're doing these pipelines, we're doing these assessments, we're doing these meetings as part of the National Energy Board, and there's going to be protesters. And for years they've been overhyping the fact that protesters are extremists and they're wild. And so we need to make sure that these protesters are under control and that these pipelines can go through. And so police get kind of brought in as like this private arm of the pipelines, really, and the companies to ensure that they can safely go about their business of building pipelines. And so police were certainly during this time, they had this interesting two-step, because at one point they were saying, we're just doing what the government and the companies are asking us to do because we're objective and we're neutral, and we're just kind of making sure that everything is peaceful, the language that they use. And then they have this kind of second step that they try and shuttle away a little bit, where they're saying, these activists are wild, these activists are criminals, these activists are extremists. So we have Aboriginal extremists and environmental extremists, and we have all of these different discourses that they are producing. So they're really circulating these ideas that these kind of political conflicts are forms of crime and forms of threat. And so they're kind of justifying their presence alongside. And one thing certainly that we underline is that, you know, in these bureaucracies, especially security and intelligence and policing bureaucracies, it was also very much in their interest, just as it is in policing today, to overhype the threats, right? So that they get more resources, they get more importance, they're more central in terms of the policing bureaucracy, in terms of competing for resources in policing. So it's very much in their interests to kind of go along with these programs.
So talk about the actual meeting of, I forget how you referred to it exactly, but it was something that was like monthly meetings of like the corporate.
It was called the Energy Stakeholders Group originally, okay. And that, you know, that was super interesting period of time. That really emerged out of the Gateway protests. Mm-hmm. So when Northern Gateway was proposed, it was proposed a bit earlier, but it really the NEB and the Harper government really started backing it in 2010, 2012-ish. Mm-hmm. Lots of mobilizations. This is BC, unceded territories, all kinds of opposition right off the bat. And immediately, you know, both the government and the companies and the police knew that there was going to be all kinds of political opposition to the process. And so what ended up happening is that they created these, they were called the Energy Stakeholders Group. And this was an institutional arrangement that happened, you know, monthly, and it continued for years, and it shifted, kind of shape-shifted once a couple independent media researchers really kind of documented it, and it kind of hit the internet, so that it, you know, it changed. But the important part and the kind of the lesson from this story is that the companies and the RCMP and a couple other actors very much said, we all need help, and we need to get more surveillance and more intelligence on all of these different groups that are mobilizing, and we need to be able to centralize this intelligence. We need to move fast and be nimble, and kind of work together. So it used this very collaborative language around, you know, maintaining the peace and researching and guarding against criminality. But the real goal was to have a kind of a collaboration. In some ways, you know, what was happening is that the companies even wanted more, right? They didn't want blockades. They didn't want to be disrupted. They wanted to be able to get into those regulatory meetings with no problems. They wanted to speed this up. And they were saying, we need more policing. We need more policing. And the police are saying, well, you know, there are some rules about policing, and we need, you know, there's, you know, this messy charter. So we could really use some help getting some private intelligence, so we can work together, right? So they ended up institutionalizing these meetings where they would meet. There was, you know, maybe there's, you know, it wasn't just the RCMP. So a kind of important element of the background is that police agencies are saying, we need rapid data sharing. And we need all of these different organizations to be able to collect intelligence and share intelligence and kind of break down these silos between different groups. So you have regional police, you have municipal police, provincial police, you have RCMP, you have Transport Canada, you have D&D, you have CSIS, you have Natural Resources Canada. You have all kinds of different players who are kind of coming to share information and to be prepared, all in the effort to speed up extraction. It's all in the effort to kind of support the pipeline agenda. And an interesting aspect of these meetings is that, you know, the private actors for security companies would have, you know, a higher standing of security access, so they'd get to kind of swap information with security intelligence agencies, and they'd also be able to upload data. So they created a data portal for these agencies to be like, oh, you know, we see something online where Greenpeace is organizing this, or this Indigenous community is having this meeting, so they can upload information right into the security establishment and put this kind of intelligence into those data banks. So it was just a very formal meeting that happened, and one of, you know, so Andy and I did a lot of access to information requests to just kind of track the meeting, see what they're talking about, see what kind of language they're using, see what kind of threats they're putting on their agenda. And, you know, there's, you know, the overlap of, you know, the kind of corporate interests and the policing interests is just kind of startling in all kinds of ways. So some of these records talk about how, you know, a lot of the guys who work for the security, either private security firms that are hired by the energy industries or run the security wings of the energy companies, are former police officers. You have these kind of interesting documents where you have these meetings that happen in Ottawa. Everyone kind of flies in, and then, you know, coffee and toast and lunch is provided and sponsored by Enbridge. It even says it on the documents, like lunch provided by Enbridge.
So brazen, eh? So brazen.
It's totally brazen. And you'd think, you know, in some contexts, people would just, you know, you think somebody would kind of just say, just on an optics level, like, this is a really bad idea. But no, like, it really just kind of underlined how closely these folks are all working together towards the same goals.
So, and then where does Project Sitka? So that was like the list of activists, right?
Yeah.
Or can you talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, Project Sitka is a super interesting set of documents that came out of our research. And really, you know, is one of these opportunities where we can kind of really see into these surveillance bureaucracies and these security bureaucracies and see how they use all the data they collect. And so what Project Sitka was, it happened in 2014, 2015. And it happened over a year period, and it was run by the RCMP security or National Security Wing in Ottawa. And what Project Sitka did is that it said, listen, I don't know more happened. There was this thing called the Twitter revolution that happened in the Middle East. People are using these social media technologies to organize and get ahead of us. And I don't know more really caught us off guard, it says. I'm saying it in a bit different language, but this is the takeaway that they preface the report with. So in order to not be caught off guard again, we need to have a permanent database that identifies leading activists and people who are really mobilizing on issues of extraction. And so what they do is they take a whole year and they task all of their partners and all kinds of different units of the RCMP, so they being the National Security Establishment in Ottawa, send it out to all of RCMP. They also send it to some private partners and other law enforcement agencies, they say. And they say, give us everything you have on the prominent organizers in your areas. Give us everything you got. And so all of these different units and nodes of the Canadian policing establishment go into their databanks. So they go in all the way back to 2010, is as far back as they've recorded going back. They go and they access data from all kinds of different demos. So some of it's teach-ins at universities, some of it's specific demos at like the oil sands or specific local kind of contestation points, conflict points. Yeah. Murdered and missing Indigenous women demos. They go back to the Olympics in Vancouver. So all kinds of different sites of activism, and they compile a list of 300 and change people. It was a bit over 300. And they, in each of these kind of profiles, they fill it with all the data they can get from all of these different data banks. Okay, so they have this kind of 300 and so profiles, and then they create this risk matrix. So this is a risk model where they associate a certain level like numerical score with a higher level of risk, and they evaluate for what they call beliefs, rhetoric, and people's threat levels through.
What's your score? What's your score, Jeff?
I don't know if I was on there. I didn't. It outdated my activism.
I hope it's nice and high. Okay.
But yeah. So when it comes back to us through access to information, it's one of these things. Sometimes they do reveal people's names and they do kind of out people and not redacting properly. But certainly this report didn't have people's names or anything. Sometimes the federal ATIP offices can be a bit loose with those kind of privacy protections, which is disappointing to see. But in this one, it was all blanked out. So we don't know who the folks are, although APTN and a couple other folks that chased it found out who these folks are. And a lot of times these are very prominent leaders and individuals, right? And so, and they have tons of information on people. So they put them through these risk scores. And at the end, they come out and say, and I apologize, I don't remember the numbers, either 87 or 89 individuals qualified as this kind of high risk category. And Andy and I have tried to chase kind of the implications of Sitka and how much has been implemented. There's a whole list of recommendations, and we haven't been that successful. In part, the access to information system, especially with the RCMP, has just become this bumbling, broken circuit. So we're still kind of waiting to see what exactly has happened from some of these recommendations. But some of the recommendations are pretty straightforward. They want this to be a permanent database that's available to frontline officers, so that when frontline officers show up to conflicts, wherever they may be, they can then plug people's name, soon, facial recognition, there's pictures of people in all of this, and be able to identify them right away with past acts. And so part of what we've really claimed out of this is, one, this goes against one of the major findings from the Ipperwash inquiry, which is a really important inquiry on everything not to do in terms of police going in with SWAT teams. And of course, they killed Dudley George in Ipperwash, and there's a set of recommendations that comes out of the inquiry. And one of the key recommendations is that you really shouldn't be profiling, and in order to de-escalate at protest sites, you shouldn't be modeling what happens at a protest site based on crime databases and police databases. And what this report's actually saying is that we need a police database for us to be prepared at these frontline places. But what we do know, certainly from research around de-escalation, most of it's from the US, but almost all the de-escalation research on policing says that when police are told that calls or incidents that they show up from are are high intensity or high priority are dangerous. If it's not dangerous, it's really dangerous all of a sudden for the person.
It's a self, right, I see.
Yeah.
Where a situation could end up as some like a peaceful protest will get escalated into
absolutely
by the police.
You're going into a dangerous situation, automatically that creates the lens in which they view everything, and things escalate.
So this sounds a lot like kind of counterinsurgency mentality. It sounds like an internal, seeing these people as potential actual threats, right? Is that the kind of mindset that you're kind of describing?
For sure. And I think so much of especially intelligence work and more and more policing has turned towards kind of preemptive types of interventions, but especially with kind of like high policing, right? The idea of security and high security. This is more and more, growing from this kind of counterinsurgency model that, goes back 40, 50 years about getting intelligence, isolating, key components and, incapacitating key components and really having a very strong form of intervention. And interesting enough too, like counterinsurgency doctrines that come from the military really kind of underline that to win hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds really relies off of winning a kind of passive majority. And that, leaders and really charismatic individuals from protests or, the enemy are the ones who we need to target because they can win that middle ground, and they need to be incapacitated and take it out. And part of what Sitka, it's a really good connection, really does, it says, these are the movers and shakers, and this is who we need to keep an eye on and demobilize in some ways. Sitka has some fascinating components. As part of Sitka was really the evaluation of the effectiveness of certain groups being able to mobilize, and even had stuff like, do they have, charismatic leaders? Do groups have charismatic leaders? Do they have a message that resonates with Canada? Is there issues of justice and injustice that the media would care about? Does it get lots of media coverage? So Sitka was actually really interested in how social movements, and especially Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders, could grasp media attention and turn it against the police. So there's a whole element of this policing response that's also tied in with their reputational interests, and seeing that Indigenous protests can kind of make them look bad, and seeing that as something that they need to undermine.
So that's really interesting. So one thing just a kind of a side point that I think is important to reiterate is that as we know, the role of the RCMP and the other arms of the state have, from the beginning of Canada's history, have always been involved in pushing Indigenous people off the land. And this is just it's almost like a natural evolution of that within the technological age. So you can speak to that if you want. But I just wanted to mention that this is not something that new. It's just kind of the style has changed, and it seems like it's gotten a bit more centralized and just all seeing and all powerful. And so you can talk to that if you want. But I also wanted to just mention, in your book, you talk about how the divide and conquer strategy was saying there's the good Indigenous people and then the radical ones. And we kind of saw that play out with the Northern Gateway Pipeline, where you had like the band councils and then the elected councils, and the media would focus on one, and it kind of creates the dangerous other, right? So yeah, if you want to touch on that.
100%. And so the police were always like, in all of these different case studies that we go through from the book for about 10 or so year period, and you can even see that nowadays. The police are always looking for kind of interlocutors. Who are they going to talk to? And oftentimes that ends up, they kind of showcase individuals who are kind of cooperative and looking to shut the protest down. And often even in RCMP presentations and stuff, they're really kind of highlighting certain Indigenous groups and Indigenous communities who are really pro pipeline and stuff like that. So absolutely, this is all very much, it's active side picking is the way that I think is a good way to characterize it. It's far from kind of neutral policing in the way that they kind of cherry pick people who they're going to work with, and then others who they're going to then slag as being violent or being extremists. it's a very old approach that the RCMP have that, again, is not, neutral policing. It's very much them being supportive of extraction. And I think part of, you make a great point just about, this is a long history that the RCMP have in terms of really targeting Indigenous communities that are resisting assimilation or resisting incursions on their land. And a key component, the real tie that I see when I look at what all these RCMP documents and look at the language that they use, and you look at all these different reports that they file, is that, there's very little difference in terms of the way that they represent communities that are resisting from, I've spent lots of time in the archives, and there's very little difference from documents you see from the Northwest Mounted Police in the 1880s after the 1885 rebellion and contemporary documents. They use the same language where communities are seen as being against economic development. They're seen as anti-Canadian. They're seen as not caring about, working class, everyday Canadians. They don't care about industry. And often it's used as language that, there are individuals in the community, and police sometimes still use this language of kind of traditional,
right?
That are backwards. They're not good at capitalism. They don't want to engage in consumerism and resource exploitation. And so those languages in some ways haven't changed in 100 and whatever years. They have a remarkable parallel. And in some ways that's like the really deep-seated, so, we can talk, I think it's really important to emphasize, these institutional arrangements where police and energy companies are working together to support extraction. But there's this whole other kind of, not necessarily institutional relationship angle, but just structural policing angle in which these views of Indigenous people are really how you account for structural racism. There is a fundamental belief within policing institutions around development, around settler colonialism being the norm, about Canada, in a lot of ways it's completely ignorant of our treaty relationships, but about Canada being kind of like a nation that's post-colonial, and that we don't have nation to nation, Indigenous people have been conquered, like a war is over or something, and that there doesn't have to be the legally and also just politically required negotiations that are absolutely essential to all of these land conflicts. So police and police culture itself, from this huge span of time, thinks of those conflicts as non-conflicts. It's just Indigenous people who don't get it, and they're there to kind of protect Canadian industry and working class white settlement. Yeah.
So within the Trudeau era, so you spoke about Harper, but let's talk about Trudeau just a little bit, about because everything got better, right? Everything was fixed, right?
What was it? Shiny days?
How would you describe the continuities from Trudeau, from Harper, or changes in rhetoric versus changes in substance? That kind of, any observations there?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a dramatic change in rhetoric, and nothing necessarily wrong with the change in rhetoric, but the practices have remained exactly the same. And so policing, security, intelligence practices, the attacking of Indigenous movements, and especially the surveillance practices, have all accelerated in ways that really, part of, a broader argument I would make is that security and policing agencies are really in control. Politicians, set a rhetorical kind of political agenda that obviously policing and security agencies can kind of hop on board when it's practical for them, which is certainly what they did during the Harper years, but they also run their own show. And there's a very strong culture and relationship in Canada that politicians and political governments don't interfere in the operations of policing and security agencies. They kind of oversee and tinker here and there, but these folks run their own show, and that show has carried on even with more resources under Trudeau. I do think that, we could talk about like the the gain in terms of political rhetoric. I actually think that, you know, Justin Trudeau stole, I don't know, Moore's language around nation-to-nation relations. And, you know, I wouldn't give him too much credit. I don't think he knows the blunder that he made, but I am glad that he made the blunder and has brought notions of nation-to-nation rhetoric into a dominant conversation that I can, you know, we can have these conversations at our dinner room tables in kind of rural Canada and talk about what nation-to-nation relations mean and what being a treaty people really means from the settler side. Yeah. So I think, you know, I don't think that was ever Trudeau's intention. I think it was a blunder. Yeah. But I do think that in terms of advancing a decolonial agenda, like if we are going to move forward decolonization, that those conversations are essential. And I do think that there's positives to take from his adoption of that language, despite, you know, the fact that policing and settler colonialism is strong and steady. I do think that we're having conversations that we didn't have, you know, certainly a decade ago. And I do think that ultimately, you know, there is a significant role for settler non-Indigenous allies in driving decolonization in our settler non-Indigenous communities. So that's there.
And would you say that the secrecy and the desire for these institutions to hide what they're doing, does that reflect a more conscious public or a more critical public? Or like, I'm trying to pull out some positive, some more hopeful things that we could maybe look to. Maybe like, you know, 50 years ago, I feel like there wouldn't be so much secrecy because maybe the population is the white, you know, more European population has kind of changed his mind. But what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. Like in some ways, you know, policing is under such scrutiny in kind of contemporary Canada, which is, you know, overdue and welcomed. So, you know, I think there's, you know, police agencies themselves have a very long history in controlling crime narratives. This is, you know, police work and police institutions themselves are just as committed to narratives about crime control than they are to crime control itself. These are institutions who are very good at communications and very good at crafting a police narrative of crime, and our social understanding of crime in Canada for a long time has been produced through policing agencies. Yeah. And so that has always been a nimble kind of release information and control information. It's a curation of what they want crime knowledge to be. And they're very good at it. They've been very good at it for decades. And so I think, you know, the war on terror really gave policing institutions just so much more power to control that narrative, especially when it comes to security, labeling security threats, talking about the good, essential, you know, kind of like virtuous work that police do. The war on terror was just a boon for their ability to control that narrative. And in some ways, I think that narrative is unraveled. And I think that's unraveled for a whole bunch of different ways. I think the biggest unraveling was Meher Arar and the Arar Commission, and subsequent commissions that really all of a sudden, maybe not pop the balloon, but let some air out of the balloon of the war on terror and let Canada and kind of, you know, the public media have conversations about what are we doing and is this too far? And, you know, like ultimately, you know, how do issues of racism impact these practices? So I think that was really a really strong starting point around the war on terror. And of course, nowadays, police are under scrutiny. And I think that invites from them more and more communications control. That's going to be their reaction. And you can see that even right now on Twitter and on different police communications channels to be putting out as much good news as they can about police, about the important work they do.
Damage control,
So I think, you know, we're getting into more and more of that, especially as defund and different movements are really taking a bite out of, you know, police power.
I was just going to ask you, so for someone who's, let's say, you know, just lives in the middle of a city, white dude, white woman, lives in a, doesn't really see the implication of this, of surveillance of Indigenous movements or the creation of this surveillance apparatus. And in a context where, in a neoliberal Canada where there's, this rampage against our public institutions, our schools, our hospitals, there's increased poverty in the streets. What would you say to those type of people who are feeling kind of like this doesn't really affect me? What would be some things you'd tell them?
Good question. Like, yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. I think people engage on policing issues in all kinds of different ways. And I think that we are in a moment where we can engage on a couple of different levels. I'm not the keenest on engaging on a financial level, but I do find that even, very neoliberal people who are all about, small government, do it yourself, think that they've made everything themselves and, ignore questions of kind of structure or privilege or whatever. I think, even nowadays, the way that police budgets are kind of completely skyrocketing, I think even those folks can be engaged and understand that, policing is a bloated beast. It is a poorly structured institution just from a financial angle. And that's not necessarily my favorite. But I do think that even, very conservative family members and even colleagues, everyone can kind of get that. And I think that is just a way of getting in and maybe just a tactic at reducing police power. But, especially in Canada and being a very urban, I'm in Ottawa and it's, it's a very urban centrist kind of place. And I do think that, that Canadian middle, that kind of that big centrist hunk of massive people in Canada, I think that even that population is really dialed into questions of structural racism, of colonization. I think the TRC report, Truth and Reconciliation report, and residential schools report was really central, actually. I think I Don't Know More was super central as well, and like the start of nation kind of talk. But I do think that the TRC, especially with young folks who are coming through the university now and who are kind of in undergrad now, who went through high school, really kind of with the TRC and the new TRC recommendations and understanding, TRC used the language of cultural genocide, but talked about genocide and talked about the current colonial present.
Yeah.
And I think those folks are tuned in and they want to talk about structural racism. They see policing as having a particularly bad structural racism problem. This entire summer of social movements and police killings have really sparked, I think, a lot of interest in those conversations. So I think there's a lot of ways to engage in those conversations. And I do think that, a whole other element of kind of the data surveillance security state question is that, I think people are tiring of the war on terror. I think people, really want to undo and rein in some of these surveillance powers. I do think that there's still maybe it's aging me, but I think there's a Snowden effect still in the public. I think people are more concerned about their data and they're more concerned about companies and the police having data. So I think it's one of these slow slogs that, really talking about these issues where police always have the head start, right? They're always able to implement these things, policing, surveillance, all of these different, they're able to just operationalize. They have the resources, they're able to just do this stuff. And then the public and critics come in afterwards and have this kind of monumental task of having to kind of catch up with what police already do and roll back their powers. And so it's always, this is always been the challenge. And I think there's, we're kind of part of that long-standing effort, but I do think that there are lots of openings and there's lots of openings to try and kind of roll back these powers.
Can you talk about your other book about security aid, Canada and the development regime of security? And you wrote this in 2017. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I was just hoping to get like kind of a snapshot about this. What are some of the take-home things that the average Canadian might want to know about?
And so the idea of security aid and the book really kind of details how development assistance really in Canada had this kind of overlapping and expertise in areas of security. So the book details all kinds of different ways in which security technologies and techniques, so police, prisons, border security, certain military technologies, a little bit of counterinsurgency, all kinds of, a lot of different policing tactics, techniques, kind kind of proliferate around the world under the banner of aid. And so a key element of the argument really was that Canada's not like the biggest player. This is a global trend, and there's all kinds of ways of doing this, but that Canada has been very effective at using this aid in very specific areas to try and advance geopolitical interests, in particular with the United States, with the EU. Sometimes these are trade interests, but they're really kind of like provincial Canadian interests that are being latched on to both an aid agenda and an aid agenda that is increasingly securitized. So it's all kinds of, the purpose of the book is really to contest this kind of like international do-gooder reputation that we often have, and really show that, one, we don't really, the good that we're doing is sometimes has a bit of a dark side if you actually research what's going on the ground. And two, the good that we're doing isn't altruistic. It's really attached to a kind of political agenda, often a trade agenda, that's really dictated by the EU and the United States.
So in turn, what are the actual nuts and bolts of some of the technologies being sold? Are we talking, so you're talking about spying technology, so are we talking computer stuff, or
it's
like barbed wire fences, or?
Yeah, so it's a whole hodgepodge. Some of it is, some of it's different fingerprint readers. Some of it is different, so border databases, different databases for sharing with multiple agencies. Some of it is, riot gear. Some of it is, electronic monitors, sometimes used in prison specifically, sometimes used, in the broader carceral. A whole bunch of it is not so much technologies, but techniques. So different trainings that RCMP, military, security intelligence analysts, all kinds of different trainings where we send correction officers, all kinds of different trainings that we send individuals around the world to do skill development. And a lot of this is, riot control, or, how to properly manage a prison, or how to share your intelligence around illegal boats or migration from Southeast Asia with our data banks and our, migration controls here in Canada. So all kinds of, there's not necessarily one big leader, but what Canada has managed to do is professionalize all kinds of little nodes and do all of these little bits all over the place that kind of enhance overall securitization and forms of social control.
Right, and in like this era of climate change and like natural destruction and mass migration from these governments that have completely destroy their public services and whatnot with this globalization, I can see how there's a niche for this market. So
totally.
I get it's about controlling labor, it's about controlling human capital. Can go around the world at a whim, but we keep people stuck where they are, right? We don't want. So I guess a lot of these, a lot of the people buying these technologies are just trying to maintain their power over. So maybe that's a hopeful thing.
And so it is kind of funny because like CBSA does a lot of this, Border Services Canada, and one of their sales pitches, we are so good at allowing goods through our customs and monitoring, because we have the US and we can get consumer goods no problem, but we can keep people out. So they have this whole language of kind of mobility control, and tying it into climate change and stuff like that is absolutely accurate, because all of these, first of all, the governments that they're dealing with are looking for aid, and a lot of this is assistance. So they'll take aid to puff up their security and policing apparatus. And Canada wants them to improve their border controls, and especially, a lot of this, especially the CBSA and RCMP's involvement, happened after the MV Sunsea arrived in Canada almost a decade ago. It was a boat carrying 500 Tamils arrived, kind of illegal, illegal refugee. This is a whole spark of this kind of discourse. And a lot of investment happens after this to try and keep boats away from Canada. So this is absolutely about population control in a world that's increasingly precarious and increasingly dynamic in terms of all kinds of threats that we're facing.
Well, Jeffrey, do you have any last thoughts? What can we expect from you in the future? Any books on the way, or papers, or?
Yeah, like I'm doing all kinds of stuff specific to the Wet'suwet'en raids that happened a year and 2 years ago, and looking at some OPP responses both to the Wet'suwet'en blockades and also what's happening right now in Haudenosaunee territory around the land back stuff. So lots of research to do. It's kind of an unlimited thing. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And I'll hopefully talk to you soon on a later episode.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, take care.